Rosaline Hart's wedding day became the worst day of her professional life, though not for the reasons most abandoned brides would cite. When her fiancé failed to appear at the cathedral that morning, leaving her standing alone in a designer gown worth more than most people's cars, she wasn't heartbroken. She was calculating losses. The marriage had never been about love. 6 months earlier, her fathers had revealed a condition that turned her inheritance into a trap. She had to be married before the fiscal year ended or lose full voting power over Hart Global, the multi-billion-dollar empire her father had built. She had 11 weeks left when the will was read, so she had done what she always did when faced with a problem. She found a solution. Her fiancé had been that solution, a man from her social circle who wanted the prestige of being married to a Hart and who understood that their arrangement was transactional. But now he had disappeared, leaving her humiliated in front of board members who had been waiting for her to fail, society photographers who would splash her abandonment across every magazine, and business partners who were already calculating how to divide her company among themselves. Richard Coleman, a senior board member who had worked with her father for 2 decades, sat in the third row with an expression that wasn't quite a smile, but close enough to make her want to throw her bouquet at his smug face. Rosaline stood at that altar for 7 minutes of silence that felt like 7 hours. She sent 9 increasingly desperate messages to her missing fiancé. She watched the priest check his watch. She felt her mother's tension radiating from the front pew, and she did what she had been trained to do since childhood. She showed nothing. Her posture remained perfect, her face composed, her grip on the bouquet steady even as her mind raced through every possible solution and found none that would save her. That was when Charles stepped forward. Charles had been her executive secretary for 4 years, a position that meant he knew her schedule better than she did, anticipated her needs before she voiced them, and managed the countless details that kept her life running smoothly. He was efficient, quiet, and so professionally invisible that Rosaline had never once considered his personal life, his hopes, or anything beyond his ability to handle her demanding schedule. She knew he lived somewhere in the city, never took vacations, and always wore charcoal gray ties. But beyond those surface details, he was simply the man who made her coffee appear at exactly the right temperature and her meetings run on time. When Charles walked up to the altar that morning with his leather portfolio folder in hand, he made her an offer that would change both their lives. He proposed a marriage of convenience, a 12-month legal contract that would satisfy her father's will and allow her to retain control of Hart Global. There would be boundaries, he explained in that same calm professional voice he used during board meetings. Separate bedrooms, no physical intimacy, no romantic expectations. They would appear together at necessary social functions, maintain the illusion of a married couple for the board and the public, and then quietly divorce once the fiscal year ended and her position was secure. Rosaline accepted before he finished explaining the terms. The ceremony proceeded within the hour. The priest, relieved to finally have a groom, performed the abbreviated service. The guests whispered and speculated, but the photographs showed a bride and groom, which was all that mattered for the legal requirements. Charles signed the marriage license with the same neat signature he used on her expense reports. Rosaline signed beside him and felt a strange mixture of relief and dread settle in her chest. She had saved her company, but she had done so by marrying a man she barely knew, a man whose last name she had never bothered to learn until it became her own, Charles Morrison. Her husband. The words felt foreign and uncomfortable, like a suit tailored for someone else's body. The reception was canceled. The guests dispersed, and Rosaline found herself in the back of her car with Charles sitting beside her in uncomfortable silence. He had saved her, yes, but neither of them seemed to know what to say now that the crisis had passed. The driver took them to Rosaline's penthouse apartment, a steel and glass fortress overlooking the city, where she had lived alone since her father's death 2 years earlier. That was when Charles revealed the complication she had not anticipated. He had a daughter, a 6-year-old daughter named Emma who lived with him full-time, whose existence he had never mentioned during 4 years of working together because Rosaline had never asked about his personal life. He explained this in the elevator, his voice apologetic but firm. Emma was not negotiable. If they were going to maintain the appearance of a real marriage, Rosaline would need to meet his daughter, spend time in his world, and accept that their arrangement came with a package deal. Rosaline felt her carefully constructed solution begin to crumble. She knew how to manage companies, navigate hostile board members, and negotiate multi-million-dollar deals. She did not know how to interact with children. She had never wanted children, never imagined them as part of her precisely organized life. The thought of a 6-year-old disrupting her schedule, asking questions, needing attention, made her want to rewrite the contract immediately, but she could not rewrite it. She had married Charles in front of witnesses, signed legal documents, and created a public record that would be scrutinized by Richard Coleman and every other board member looking for evidence that her marriage was a sham. If she wanted to keep Hart global, she would have to become not just a wife, but a stepmother, at least in appearance. Charles seemed to sense her panic. He suggested a compromise. Instead of Rosaline integrating Emma into her penthouse life, she would move into his home for the duration of their arrangement. It would look more authentic, he reasoned, and it would be easier for Emma to maintain her routine in familiar surroundings. Rosaline agreed because she had no better option, and because the alternative was explaining to a 6-year-old why her father's new wife refused to live with them. The next morning, Rosaline Hart, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar empire, packed 2 suitcases of designer clothing and moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood 40 minutes from her office. The house was nothing like her penthouse. It had furniture that looked comfortable rather than expensive, photographs on the walls instead of abstract art, and a kitchen that showed signs of actual cooking rather than catered meals. Charles's daughter Emma met her at the door, a small girl with dark curly hair and her father's serious eyes, and asked Rosaline if she was going to be her new mommy. Rosaline had faced hostile takeover attempts, corporate espionage, and board meetings designed to humiliate her, but nothing had prepared her for the direct and innocent question of a 6-year-old child. She told Emma that she was married to her father, which was true, and that she would be living with him, which was also true, but she could not bring herself to claim the title of mother. Emma seemed satisfied with the non-answer and proceeded to show Rosaline her room, her toys, and her collection of rocks from the backyard, chattering continuously in a way that made Rosaline's organized mind feel like it was short-circuiting. The first week was a disaster. Rosaline tried to maintain her normal schedule, waking at 5 in the morning to review reports and prepare for meetings, but Emma woke at 6 and needed breakfast, attention, and help getting ready for school. Charles managed both his daughter's needs and his job with a competence that Rosaline found both impressive and bewildering. He made lunches, signed permission slips, attended parent-teacher conferences, and still showed up at the office with her coffee at exactly the right temperature. Rosaline, meanwhile, struggled with every aspect of domestic life. She did not know how to cook anything beyond coffee. She had no idea what a 6-year-old should eat, where, or do for entertainment. When Emma asked her to read a bedtime story, Rosaline read from a business biography until Charles gently suggested that fairy tales might be more appropriate. She felt completely out of her depth, useless in a way she had never experienced in the boardroom. Richard Coleman began his investigation within days of the wedding. He hired a private investigator to follow them, document their living arrangements, and search for evidence that the marriage was a fraud. Charles and Rosaline learned about the surveillance when they spotted the same car parked across from the house 3 nights in a row. They realized they would need to be more convincing, more careful, more committed to performance. That meant Rosaline attending Emma's school events, sitting beside Charles at parent meetings, and learning to navigate a world where her professional skills meant nothing. It meant holding Charles's hand when they walked Emma to the park, kissing his cheek for the benefit of neighbors who might report back to investigators, and slowly, uncomfortably, beginning to blur the lines between performance and reality. The transformation happened gradually, so gradually that Rosaline did not notice until she was already changing. It started with small things, practical adjustments that seemed necessary for maintaining their cover story. She learned Emma's routine because failing to know it would raise suspicions. She attended school pickup because a wife who never appeared at her stepdaughter's school would seem strange. She sat through dance recitals, help with homework, and figure out how to make macaroni and cheese from a box because Charles worked late some evenings and Emma needed to eat. But somewhere between the second week and the second month, the performance stopped feeling like work and started feeling like something else. Something Rosaline did not have a name for and did not particularly want to examine too closely. Emma was a catalyst for most of this uncomfortable change. The child had no concept of boundaries, no understanding that Rosaline preferred to work in silence, and no fear of asking deeply personal questions at inappropriate moments. She wanted to know why Rosaline never smiled, why she wore uncomfortable-looking shoes, why she always carried her phone to the dinner table. Emma asked if Rosaline liked her, if Rosaline wanted to be her mother, if Rosaline would leave like Emma's birth mother had left when Emma was 2 years old. That last question hit Rosaline harder than she wanted to admit. Charles had eventually explained, in careful terms during a late-night conversation after Emma was asleep, that his ex-wife had struggled with motherhood and had left when Emma was still in diapers. She sent birthday cards twice a year, but otherwise had no contact with her daughter. Charles had raised Emma alone since then, managing single parenthood while working full-time as Rosaline's secretary, a juggling act that suddenly made his efficiency and dedication make more sense. Rosaline found herself thinking about that a lot, about Charles waking early to pack lunches before coming to the office, about him leaving work exactly at 5:30 every day, not because he lacked commitment, but because he had a child waiting for dinner, about all the time she had made last-minute demands on his schedule, without considering that he had a life, a daughter, responsibilities beyond her endless emails. It made her feel, for perhaps the first time in her adult life, uncomfortably self-centered. The board meetings continued throughout this period, tense affairs where Richard Coleman asked pointed questions about her marriage, her stability, her judgment. He suggested that a CEO who made impulsive decisions in her personal life might make similar mistakes with the company. He questioned whether someone who had been abandoned at the altar had the leadership qualities necessary for a global corporation. He never quite accused her of fraud, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. Rosaline deflected, redirected, and presented quarterly reports that showed Hart Global thriving under her leadership. But she could feel the board's skepticism, their eagerness to find a reason to invoke the clause in her father's will that would strip her of voting power. They were watching her marriage for cracks, waiting for proof that it was exactly what they suspected, a desperate attempt to hold on to power she did not deserve. To counter this, Charles began attending public events with her. He stood beside her at charity galas, his hand resting lightly on her back in a gesture that looked affectionate but felt like performance. He smiled for photographs, made small talk with board member spouses, and played the role of devoted husband with a competence that Rosaline found both helpful and slightly disturbing. It was too easy for him, this pretending, and she sometimes wondered if he found it as uncomfortable as she did, or if he simply had more practice at hiding his true feelings. They developed a routine during this time. Charles would put Emma to bed around 8, and then he and Rosaline would sit in the small living room with coffee, reviewing the day's developments and planning for the next crisis. These late-night conversations became the strangest part of their arrangement because they were the only moments when neither of them was performing for Emma, for the board, or for the private investigators who occasionally still followed them. In these quiet hours, Rosaline learned things about Charles that she had never thought to ask. He had studied business in college, but had taken the secretary position because it offered stability and health insurance when Emma was born. He read voraciously, everything from philosophy to science fiction, and had opinions about economic policy that were often sharper than those of the Harvard graduates on her board. He had dreams of someday starting his own business, but had set them aside when his ex-wife left, choosing security over ambition because he had a daughter depending on him. Rosaline told him things too, though she was less accustomed to sharing personal information. She talked about her father, a brilliant and cold man who had taught her to value results over relationships, to see vulnerability as weakness, and to believe that power was the only thing that mattered. She explained that Hart Global was not just a company to her, but the only legacy her father had left, the only way she could prove that his choice to name her successor had been correct. Losing it would mean admitting that Richard Coleman and all the others who doubted her were right. Charles listened to all of this without judgment, and then he said something that stayed with Rosaline long after their conversation ended. He told her that her father had been wrong about vulnerability, that raising Emma had taught him that real strength came from being able to care about something more than you cared about protecting yourself. He suggested that maybe Rosaline's problem was not that she lacked power, but that she had confused power with control, and the two were not the same thing. Rosaline did not know what to do with this observation, so she changed the subject and went to bed in her separate room, where she lay awake thinking about it for most of the night. Emma continued to be a persistent and unwelcome disruption to Rosaline's carefully controlled emotional landscape. The child had decided that Rosaline needed to be taught how to have fun, a concept Rosaline had not seriously considered since she was Emma's age. Emma dragged her to the park, insisted they bake cookies together even though Rosaline had never baked anything in her life, and demanded that Rosaline play elaborate pretend games involving stuffed animals and imaginary kingdoms. Rosaline participated because she had to maintain appearances, but somewhere around the third month, she realized she was participating because she wanted to, because Emma's laughter was strangely addictive, and because it felt good to be needed for something other than quarterly reports and strategic decisions. This realization terrified her more than any hostile board member ever had. The first major crisis came in month 4 when Richard Coleman announced at a board meeting that he had evidence suggesting Rosaline's marriage was fraudulent. He did not present this evidence immediately, instead suggesting that the board would vote at the next meeting on whether to remove her as CEO pending an investigation. The vote was scheduled for 3 weeks away, which gave Rosaline exactly 21 days to prove her marriage was real. Charles and Rosaline discussed their options at night in their usual spot on the living room couch, but for the first time since their arrangement began, neither of them had an obvious solution. They were already living together, attending events together, and maintaining the appearance of a married couple. What more could they do to convince the board they were not committing fraud? Charles suggested they stop trying to convince the board and start actually living like a married couple, which meant dropping some of the boundaries they had established on their wedding day. Not all the boundaries, he clarified quickly, just the ones that made them seem like business partners rather than spouses. They could share meals as a family every night, rather than Rosaline eating in her room. While working, they could attend more of Emma's activities together. They could act less formal with each other in public, use first names instead of Ms. Hart and Charles, touch each other with the casual ease of people who have been intimate rather than the careful distance of colleagues. Rosaline agreed because she had no choice, but the shift felt dangerous in a way she could not quite articulate. She had been comfortable with the formal boundaries, with the clear distinction between performance and reality. Blurring those lines meant risking something she had spent her entire adult life avoiding: genuine connection. The changes were small but significant. Rosaline started joining Charles and Emma for breakfast, instead of leaving early for the office. She sat beside Charles on the couch in the evenings rather than in the separate chair across the room. She called him Charles in public rather than Mr. Morrison, and he started calling her Rosaline instead of Ms. Hart. They held hands without thinking about it. And sometimes Charles would kiss her forehead when saying goodnight, a gesture that felt protective rather than romantic, but still made Rosaline's heart do strange, uncomfortable things. Emma noticed the changes immediately and seemed delighted by them. She started calling Rosaline Rosie without permission and insisted that they take a family photograph for her school project about families. Rosaline posed for that photograph with Charles's arm around her waist and Emma sitting on her lap. And when she saw the developed picture a week later, she was startled by how normal they looked, how much they resembled an actual family rather than a business arrangement. The annual Hart Foundation Gala arrived in month 5, a major social event that would be attended by board members, business partners, and media outlets. Rosaline had been planning this gala for months, back when she had a different fiancé and a different vision for how her life would unfold. Now she was attending it with Charles, and she knew that Richard Coleman would be watching their every interaction for signs of fraud. Charles prepared for the gala with the same attention to detail he brought to every task. He purchased a new suit, rehearsed small talk topics, and even practiced dancing with Rosaline in their living room while Emma giggled and provided commentary. Rosaline found herself noticing things about Charles during these practices that she had somehow missed in 4 years of working together. The way he moved with quiet confidence, the way he listened more than he spoke, the way he made her feel steadier just by being present. These observations were inconvenient and unwelcome, so Rosaline tried to ignore them. The gala itself was a performance from start to finish. Rosaline wore a gown that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and Charles stood beside her in his new suit, looking more like her equal than her employee. They greeted guests together, danced together, and navigated the complex social dynamics of wealthy people competing for status. Richard Coleman watched them with barely concealed suspicion, and Rosaline knew he was waiting for them to make a mistake, to slip up and reveal the transactional nature of their relationship. They did not slip up. They had become too good at pretending, or perhaps they were no longer pretending at all. Rosaline could not tell anymore, and that ambiguity was the most frightening thing of all. Late in the evening, after most of the guests had moved to the bar or the dancing area, Charles and Rosaline found themselves alone on a balcony overlooking the city. The air was cold, and Charles offered her his jacket without being asked. They stood in silence for a while, and then Charles said something that changed the entire nature of their arrangement. He told her that he was no longer sure this was just a contract for him, that spending 5 months living as her husband had made him realize he wanted it to be real, that he had feelings for her he had not planned on developing and did not quite know what to do with. He said he would honor their original agreement if that was what she wanted, would divorce her quietly when the fiscal year ended and go back to being her secretary as if nothing had changed. But he wanted her to know that he would not be pretending anymore, that whatever he felt for her was genuine even if she could not return it. Rosaline stood on that balcony and felt the careful walls she had spent her entire life building begin to crack. She wanted to tell Charles that she felt something too, something inconvenient and terrifying and completely inappropriate for a woman who had married him to save her company. But she could not make herself say the words, could not admit to vulnerability when Richard Coleman was probably watching from inside, when her entire future depended on maintaining control. So instead, she thanked Charles for his honesty, told him she needed time to think, and went back inside to smile for the cameras and pretend her world was not shifting beneath her feet. Listen, if you've made it this far in the story, you're invested. You want to know what happens to them. But here's the thing. Most people scroll past these stories without subscribing. They watch, they enjoy, and they disappear. If this story matters to you, if you actually care how it ends, hit that subscribe button, please. It takes 2 seconds. And if you don't, you'll probably forget about this channel and never another amazing stories from me. Richard Coleman made his move 2 weeks after the gala. He presented the board with a folder full of evidence that he claimed proved Rosaline's marriage was fraudulent. There were photographs of her moving into Charles's house with only 2 suitcases, suggesting she had never intended to stay long-term. There were interviews with neighbors who described seeing Rosaline and Charles maintain a careful physical distance in public, not touching or showing affection the way married couples typically did in their first year of marriage. There was documentation showing that Charles was still employed as Rosaline's secretary with no change in his salary or position, implying that nothing real had changed between them except a marriage license. Most damaging of all, Richard had obtained a copy of Emma's school enrollment forms from before the wedding, which listed Charles as a single father with no spouse. He argued that if Rosaline and Charles had been in a genuine relationship before the wedding, Emma's forms would have reflected that. The fact that they did not suggest that the marriage had been sudden, impulsive, and designed primarily to satisfy the requirements of her father's will. The board called an emergency meeting to review the evidence and determine whether Rosaline's marriage constituted fraud. If they decided it did, they would vote to remove her as CEO and redistribute her voting shares among the other board members. The meeting was scheduled for the end of the week, giving Rosaline exactly 4 days to mount a defense. Rosaline's first instinct was to lawyer up, to fight the accusations with legal arguments and procedural technicalities. Her marriage was legal, documented, and satisfied the literal requirements of her father's will. The will had not specified that the marriage needed to be based on love, or that it needed to predate her father's death. It simply required her to be married, which she was. But Charles pointed out the flaw in this strategy. Even if she won on legal grounds, the board could still remove her through other means. They could argue she lacked judgment, that her willingness to enter a fraudulent marriage demonstrated poor decision-making that made her unfit to lead a global corporation. They could leak the story to the media and destroy her reputation, even if they could not remove her legally. Richard Coleman did not need to win the legal argument. He just needed to create enough doubt and scandal to force her out. The only way to truly defeat Richard's accusations was to prove that the marriage was real, that her feelings for Charles were genuine, and that she had not married him solely for control of the company. This meant Rosaline would have to do something she had spent her entire adult life avoiding: be vulnerable in front of people who wanted to destroy her. She and Charles spent those 4 days preparing for the board meeting, like lawyers preparing for trial. They documented their relationship, gathering photographs of family dinners, Emma's school events, and quiet moments that showed them living as a married couple rather than as business associates. They prepared testimony about how their relationship had developed, how they had grown closer over the months, and how what started as a practical arrangement had evolved into something genuine. But documentation and testimony were not enough. Rosaline knew that Richard and the rest of the board would see through any prepared presentation, would recognize it as another performance designed to manipulate them. If she wanted them to believe her marriage was real, she would have to give them something she had never given anyone: the truth about how she felt. This terrified her more than any business challenge ever had. Rosaline had built her entire identity around control, around never showing weakness or uncertainty, around being a kind of leader who made decisions based on logic rather than emotion. Admitting to the board that she had fallen in love with her secretary, that she had allowed personal feelings to develop in what was supposed to be a purely transactional arrangement, felt like admitting failure. Charles seemed to sense her struggle. On the night before the board meeting, after Emma had gone to bed, he sat beside Rosaline on the couch and told her something that had been true from the beginning, but that she had been too blind to see. He said that marrying her had never been just a practical decision for him, that he had been half in love with her for years, watching her command boardrooms and build empires and maintain perfect composure even when everything around her was falling apart. He had never said anything because he was her employee and because he assumed someone like her could never be interested in someone like him. When she had been abandoned at the altar, Charles had seen an opportunity not just to help her, but to be with her in a way he had never imagined possible. The contract marriage had been his idea, yes, but it had never been just a business arrangement for him. He had gone into it hoping that maybe, over time, she might see him as something more than her secretary, might develop feelings that went beyond gratitude and convenience. Rosaline listened to this confession and realized that she had been protecting herself from exactly the wrong thing. She had been so afraid of losing control, of showing vulnerability, of admitting that she needed something beyond power and success, that she had nearly destroyed the one genuine relationship she had built in years. Charles had been offering her something real from the beginning, and she had been too afraid to accept it. She told him all of this that night, sitting on the couch in the small house that had somehow become more of a home than her expensive penthouse ever was. She admitted that she loved him, that she had been falling in love with him gradually over the past 6 months, and had been too terrified to acknowledge it because love had always seemed like a weakness her father would have despised. She said she was tired of pretending, tired of performing, tired of treating her life like a business deal that needed to be managed and optimized. Charles kissed her then, properly kissed her for the first time since their wedding day, and Rosaline felt something inside her finally relax, some long-held tension finally release. They did not sleep together that night. There would be time for that later, but they sat together on the couch until early morning, talking about what their future might look like if they stopped thinking of their marriage as a contract and started thinking of it as a partnership. The board meeting began at 9 the next morning in Hart Global's main conference room. All 12 board members were present, along with the company's legal counsel, and a court reporter to document the proceedings. Richard Coleman presented his evidence first, laying out his case that Rosaline's marriage was fraudulent and that she had violated the spirit of her father's will even if she had technically satisfied its requirements. Rosaline listened to his presentation without interrupting, watching the other board members' faces as they reviewed the photographs, the interviews, and the documentation. She could see some of them nodding along, already convinced. Others looked uncertain, waiting to hear her defense before making up their minds. When Richard finished, the board chair asked Rosaline to present her response. She stood at the front of the conference room, the same place where she had presented countless quarterly reports and strategic plans, and she did something she had never done in a professional setting before. She told them the truth. She explained that, yes, the marriage had started as a practical arrangement designed to satisfy her father's will. She did not apologize for this or try to hide it, because lying would only make Richard's accusations more credible. She acknowledged that she had been desperate, humiliated, and focused primarily on maintaining control of the company her father had built. But then she told them what had happened after that desperate wedding day. How living with Charles and Emma had forced her to confront the emptiness of a life built entirely around work and control. How Charles had shown her a different way of being strong, one that allowed for vulnerability and connection rather than requiring perfect composure at all times. How Emma had taught her that some of the most important things in life could not be managed or optimized or controlled, that sometimes you had to just be present and see what happened. She told the board that she had fallen in love with Charles, genuinely and completely, in a way that had nothing to do with saving the company and everything to do with who he was as a person. She said that if they wanted to remove her as CEO because she had made a strategic marriage that turned into real love, then they should go ahead and vote. But she would not pretend anymore, would not distance herself from Charles to protect her position, would not sacrifice the only genuine relationship she had built in years just to hold on to power. The room was silent when she finished. Richard Coleman looked like he wanted to object, to point out inconsistencies or demand more proof, but the board chair held up a hand to stop him. Instead, the chair asked Charles to speak, to confirm or deny Rosaline's account. Charles stood and said something simple and devastatingly effective. He told the board that he loved Rosaline, that he had loved her long before she married him, and that he would continue loving her whether or not she remained CEO of Hart Global. He said that their marriage was real in every way that mattered, that they had built a life together over the past 6 months, and that no amount of investigation or documentation could change that truth. Then he did something that surprised everyone, including Rosaline. He resigned from his position as her executive secretary, effective immediately. He explained that he was doing this to eliminate any suggestion of impropriety, to make clear that his relationship with Rosaline was not dependent on his employment or his salary or any professional benefit. He said he would find other work, that he had skills and experience that would translate to other positions, and that his marriage to Rosaline would continue regardless of what the board decided. The gesture was unnecessary and probably financially foolish, but it was also undeniably genuine. No one who was pretending would quit a stable, well-paying job to prove their marriage was real. No one who was in it for professional advancement would sacrifice their career to make a point. The board deliberated for 3 hours while Rosaline, Charles, and Richard Coleman waited in separate rooms. Rosaline spent that time thinking about what she would do if the board voted to remove her, how she would restructure her life if she lost the company that had defined her entire adult existence. She realized, somewhat surprisingly, that she would be okay. Disappointed, certainly, and angry at the injustice of being removed for the same kind of strategic thinking her father had always praised. But she would survive because she had something now that she had not had 6 months ago. People who mattered more than her position. The board called them back at 2 in the afternoon. The chair announced that they had voted 8-4 to retain Rosaline as CEO. The majority had been persuaded that her marriage, while unconventional in its origins, was genuine in its current form. More importantly, several board members had pointed out that Rosaline's leadership over the past 6 months had been exemplary, that the company was thriving under her guidance, and that removing her based on personal decisions rather than professional performance would be both unethical and unwise. Richard Coleman objected, argued, and threatened legal action, but he had lost. The board had made its decision, and Rosaline's position was secure. The victory at the board meeting did not solve everything, but it changed the fundamental nature of Rosaline and Charles's relationship. They were no longer pretending to be married, while counting down the months until their contract ended. They were actually married, committed to each other, and trying to figure out what that meant for their future. The first major change was that Charles found new employment. He had meant his resignation seriously and refused to return to his position as Rosaline's secretary even when she offered. It would look wrong, he explained, and more importantly, it would feel wrong. He needed to establish his own career, independent of her, if they were going to build a genuine partnership rather than recreating the employer-employee dynamic that had defined their relationship for years. He took a position as an operations manager at a mid-sized consulting firm, a job that paid less than his secretary position, had but offered more opportunity for advancement. Rosaline supported the decision, even though she missed having him in the office, missed the efficiency of working with someone who anticipated her needs and managed her chaos. She hired a new secretary, a competent woman named Patricia, who was perfectly good at her job, but who was not Charles. Emma adjusted to the changes with the resilience of children who have already survived their mother's abandonment and their father's emergency wedding. She seemed happy that Rosaline was no longer pretending, that the carefully maintained distance had dissolved into something warmer and more genuine. Emma started asking Rosaline to help with homework, to attend school events, to participate in bedtime routines. Rosaline discovered that she did not mind these requests as much as she had expected, that there was something satisfying about being needed for reasons that had nothing to do with quarterly reports. She was still not sure she was good at the stepmother role. She made mistakes constantly, forgot important dates, and sometimes scheduled work calls during times she had promised to be available for Emma. But she was trying, and Emma seemed to appreciate the effort even when the execution was imperfect. Rosaline and Charles moved out of a small house after about 8 months of marriage and purchased a larger home together, a compromise between her preference for modern architecture and his preference for spaces that felt lived in. They picked furniture together, argued about paint colors, and slowly created a space that belonged to both of them rather than to the person who had gotten there first. They also, finally, eliminated the last remaining boundary from their original contract. The separate bedrooms were combined into one, and their relationship became fully intimate in ways it had not been during the first 6 months of careful distance. Rosaline had been nervous about this transition, worried that it would somehow expose her inadequacy or reveal that she did not know how to be with someone without maintaining professional boundaries. But Charles was patient, and the physical intimacy turned out to be easier than she had anticipated, perhaps because the emotional intimacy had already been established. They learned each other gradually, without pressure, and Rosaline discovered that vulnerability in this context did not feel like weakness. It felt like trust, like safety, like something she wanted rather than something she feared. The fiscal year ended 10 months after their wedding, which meant that technically, Rosaline could have divorced Charles at that point while still retaining full control of Hart Global. The board could not remove her now even if they discovered the marriage had been a sham, because she had already satisfied the requirements of her father's will. She was safe, secure, and no longer dependent on Charles for her position. They never discussed divorce. The contract they had signed in that desperate moment at the altar had become irrelevant, superseded by feelings and commitments that had nothing to do with board votes or voting shares. Rosaline kept the contract in her desk drawer at the office, occasionally pulling out to reread the formal, businesslike terms that had once defined their relationship. The document felt like a relic from a different life, from a version of herself who had believed that power and control were the only things that mattered. Richard Coleman left Hart Global 6 months after his failed attempt to remove Rosaline. He took a position at a competitor company, and Rosaline was professional enough to wish him. So here's the real question. Did you subscribe yet? Thousands of people will listen to this story and won't subscribe. Please don't be that person. Kindly support what I do here by subscribing. And then also drop in the comment section if you would like part 2.